You're listening to Homeschool Connections, brought to you by the Homeschool Research Lab at the Johns Hopkins School of Education, Institute for Education Policy. The Homeschool Research Lab aims to inform and influence evidence-based education policy by expanding access to homeschool data and conducting high-quality research. Through our Homeschool Hub and diverse collaborative efforts, we provide unbiased information, share rigorous academic studies, and translate findings into actionable policy insights that can ultimately benefit all students, including those that are homeschooled. I'm Christy Batts, a research fellow for the lab. In each episode, we'll dive into the latest research, data, and insights surrounding homeschooling. We'll dispel myths, inform stakeholders, and advance evidence-driven discussions. We are here with Dr. Timberly Baker. She is an associate professor of education leadership at Arkansas State University. And through her research, she aims to improve educational outcomes for marginalized K-12 students and their educational providers through her examination of policy, practice, and praxis. She is an expert in education in the Black Belt of the American South, which includes studies on rurality, school community impacts, and home education. She is also herself a home educator. Welcome, Dr. Baker. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me and for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So tell us about rural home education.
I think the value of looking at home education specific to locale in terms of rurality is really important because our dynamics of access, resources, in some cases, intention also varies more than some of our more urban counterparts, which a lot of our research is localized within urban and suburban context. So thinking about rural home education, a couple of things are more people live in rural spaces in the United States, more specifically for the population that I'm most focused on in terms of home education, which is Black home education, that the greatest concentrations of Black individuals live in the American Southern Black Belt, which are the 8 states across the South that have the highest density and populations of Black folks, period. But then even more so, Black folks living in rural places as well. And so I think home education in that context, it gets into a conversation about not just what are we doing, but then also accessing resources and how that might look different from our urban counterparts. Additionally, oftentimes legislation and policy application looks different in rural context than it does in urban. I think it's important to really parse out some of our locale differences when it comes to educational outcomes and specific to home education around resources, access, and what those populations are understanding what they're doing.
Yeah, you talked about 8 states. So can you just name those 8 states so that you can bring us into the space?
Yeah, sure. So when you're thinking about the American South, that's loaded in terms of the language of the American South, especially if you're American and you know the historical and contextual meaning of a lot of that. So the 8 states that are in the American Southern Black Belt that I focus on are starting from east to west: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and some counties in Texas. So sometimes Texas is included. That's a data decision, but most commonly the 8 that I initially named are the ones that I focus on. Just a quick historical point about that. I don't want to dismiss or leave out that realistically part of that has to do with Deep South in terms of historically chattel slavery. And so those concentrations of populations across the American Southern Black Belt, the Black Belt gets its name from the fertility of the soil and agriculture and the richness of the land. And so as we think about rurality, that's all a part of the context of rural as well. And that includes histories around sharecropping post the Civil War. And then a lot of the movements within the civil rights movement happened in the American Southern Black Belt. So there's such a rich history around Black folks and educational outcomes in those spaces. So the Little Rock Nine, which is in Arkansas, all right, we talk about integration and desegregation, the Montgomery bus boycotts in Alabama. So I could keep going, but the point I'm making is that, these are high concentrations of folks. And so really thinking about our history in that way, I think is really valuable.
And the Greensboro lunch counter, if we're going to pull it all the way
Yes.
over to
Yep.
North Carolina as well. But yes, I'm curious just because you know a lot about education and the rural education in general. But what should be researched in home education in rural spaces?
I think some interesting things are starting with resources. I'll start there. So in our rural context, one thing that home educators across the board often talk about is the importance of public libraries as a function and a part of the homeschooling culture, milieu, and content in terms of what they have access to for their students. And so our rural libraries often are underfunded. They can be very small in terms of the actual number of books and resources that they have, but they're also rich in community support. So I'll give you a concrete example because I am a homeschooler, so my own experience, my oldest daughter was reading 4 grade levels ahead, I think, at this point. So we would go to the library at least every Thursday. And so we knew our librarians well. And so when she ran out of reading, our librarian said, let me talk to some of my other library friends and see what else I can get you, you know? And she did that for us, right? So it felt like a very community support type relationship. And that's valuable because we know our librarian personally, which you may not if you live in a more urban place. So I think there's value there. But again, the types of materials that were in our local library were not as vast as they were in our other spaces. There's less content within those libraries. Computer equipment is often not as up to date as in larger library systems. And so I don't want to diminish the value by any means because it's super valuable and very important. But these are some distinctions that we have between rural local libraries. It does limit the types of materials that might be available to your children based on your rural place and library. And then also being in rural places, you may not have a local library near you. So in a lot of rural counties, you only have a single library that's serving the whole county versus in some of our urban places, you might have 12 libraries in the same city. And so that's an example of the resource piece that's very integral to all homeschoolers, regardless of where you live. The local library is a very important part of the homeschooling journey, but contextually where it differs in terms of rural and our counterparts who are in other locale contexts is about those resources. Another piece is about the relationship between the local school district and rural homeschoolers. And this varies by state, which we know is true across all of our contexts for home education, is that the state you live in makes a tremendous difference on any of these dynamics. So I'm not speaking to a specific state, but I am giving some sort of general points about the dynamics related to rural versus our urban counterparts. One, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later too as we get into some of my other research, is that in our rural context, you often have either really tight-knit relationships with those local school district, or you are perceived to have divested themselves from the local school district and like we don't really deal with you. The other part of that, though, is that you don't have, as a home educator, you don't have other choices necessarily around other schools or districts that you can connect with when you're in a rural place. So we're often talking about singular school districts. You're not in a place where you've got within a 10-mile radius 3 different school districts or things like that. You also likely have much lower access to private schools to partner with for some of the resources or support that you need. Because if there is a private school in your county, they may not offer any type of supports for homeschoolers because there's no tuition exchange or monetary exchange that's implicit versus our public school districts. As home educators, we still pay property taxes, which means we're still generally paying into the public school system. So the expectation to then have some type of access, support, resources from them looks different. And so in our rural context, I think that's really important, is that the local school district piece, at best, you're dealing with maybe 2 districts that you might have access to and very low likelihood of multiple choices in terms of private schools. And so your direct schooling supports are lower than many of our counterparts in urban spaces who we hear more about making these requests of school districts that get answered in ways that our rural school district may not. Now, what I will say is that our rural schools, because many times we're in close community, is that you may have a teacher friend or somebody you go to church with and you can ask them questions because you know them really well. But the official relationship with the school district varies in terms of the strength of that relationship for home educators. One benefit, though, is that, if you got a strong athlete, they usually try and make some try to make some things work. But I think that is one of the challenges, is the perception by the local school district, that issue around divestment versus just trying to make a choice that is best for my child.
I'm curious about your work specifically in Black home education as well. Tell us about the intersection of race and rurality and what that means specifically for homeschool policy and practice.
One of the things we have to back up and talk about is the perception of who homeschools. So I won't belabor it for long. But one of the American images of who homeschools is traditionally a two-parent household. They are white, they are Christian, they are conservative, and they're homeschooling their children as a function of their faith or religious beliefs. So that's the common trope of individuals who homeschool. So, in terms of Black home education, we already just by being Black and home educating disrupt that trope. Because it automatically gets disrupted, also, unfortunately, the perspective becomes suspicious. And so that becomes a challenge. The other part is that when you have a certain imagery of who homeschools, and you run into bodies and families that don't match that, you tend to exclude them from your thinking about who's impacted by legislative decisions or policy decisions. Because if you assume that everyone is in a two-parent household, the rhetoric and discourse that's used around homeschooling is very centered on the traditional family structure without taking into account some of these other functions and ways in which families who are home educating do. So, for example, we know that I'm generalizing for conversation. It's less likely to find a Black mother who doesn't work, whereas our white counterparts is less likely to find a white mother who does work full time outside the home. So that's a major distinction. And as we think about policy practices and legislation, that by itself is a big part of perspective on your agency and ability to do certain things and the ways in which they traditionally perceive it. Another thing is that representation in legislative and policy conversations historically in our white counterparts context is white males are who represent homeschooling, which I found fascinating initially. The mother oftentimes is who's responsible for the actual implementation of homeschooling, but they're representing it. And so one thing you'll notice is that when you get into policy and legislative conversations around Black homeschooling and those who are non-white, it's much more women in that conversation because they're the ones who are actually doing the home educating versus our white counterparts who seem to be more represented by men, which aligns with this traditional construct of male as head of household within Christian context, and he speaks for the home. And so, in that alignment and in that imaginary and trope of who homeschools, it makes sense that he's who's representing it, but in practice, those are some distinct differences. Policy and legislators don't make up the difference for that. Sometimes what occurs is that at the end, Black and brown bodies are left out of those conversations because it's not men representing them, which is what the expectation is. In terms of our white counterparts, you find more white families who are generationally homeschooling than families of color, which is another part of this conversation. Many of our Black and brown families are first generation homeschoolers, meaning the parents that are home educating at the time were most often public school educated. And so they're a first generation home educator versus some of our white counterparts who are second, third, and so on. Generational homeschoolers, and it's an expectation of their families and the culture that they've grown up in that this is what they would do. And for many of our Black and brown families, it becomes countercultural, actually. And legislation and policy doesn't keep up with those dynamics and nuances between the different groups in terms of how things get enacted or even thought about. Another is contextually what people perceive as being taught within those households. And so this gets interesting. A colleague of mine, Najarian Peters, Kansas University Law School, her work on privacy rights and homeschooling, but more specifically, her work on the privacy piece. I'm gonna give a quick little nugget on this has to do with opt out. So opt out in public schools essentially says that if the public school is doing something that you as a parent don't agree with fundamentally for religious or cultural reasons, you can say, nope, my child won't participate in this. So we see this happen around LGBTQA, sexual education, those types of spaces is where we see it happen most frequently. That's not all the places, but that's where it happens most frequently. And then also in relationship to banning books and or banning curricular content that is counter to whatever their fundamental beliefs are. So if we think about privacy and homeschool legislation, sometimes what can also occur is that as homeschooling legislation is being thought of, and parameters are being built, they're not considering all of the bodies that are actually home educating, which means they may create some parameters that are antithetical to the freedom that they're saying home education gives you. So, concretely, you may have homeschooling legislation, and this is true in some states, where they review your portfolio or your curricular choices, and the state is reviewing what you do with your child and has put out approved lists. And we have found that some of those parameters often leave out Black authors, they leave out Black artists, they leave out seminal figures for within Blackness. And because the legislation has not actually considered who all is home educating. And I imagine for my Indigenous and Latino family counterparts that this may be true for them as well. Um, that's not work that I do to examine, but because of the ways in which it operates around Black families, I imagine that it is true for them as well. And so those are some concrete examples of where this legislation and policy piece is important for considering the intersection of race and rurality for families, but also for legislators to really consider, do you actually know enough about who's home educating in your state? And do you care enough about who's home educating in your state in order to take them into consideration in relationship to these types of policy and legislative choices?
Yeah, I think that bringing it back to how things actually affect the student is one of the strengths that you have as a researcher. I'm being reminded right now of some of your previous work in the school to prison pipeline as you reflect on your research through the years and how you've brought in different pieces, but it seems to coalesce around space. How all the pieces that you've researched through the years are kind of coming together now.
Yeah, so there's a twofold sort of answer. I'm gonna take you back and then bring you forward. When I first moved to Arkansas State, which I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to take this urban school to prison pipeline work that I've already been doing. At the time, I had a 5-year community engaged participatory action research project. We were still analyzing data and we were supporting the community group for African American parents around the school to prison pipeline. And so I said, oh, I'm going to take that work and apply it in a rural context. That's what I thought. So that's what I set out to do originally. What I started to learn, though, is that, and this is why context matters, is that they are not contextually easy to just port from one to the other. And a major reason why is access and number of schools. So the suburban space where I have been doing that work, that district had 5 high schools, and each high school had like a middle school and a junior high, and then at least 3 feeder elementary schools. So that sort of tells you generally how big it is, right? So if you live in that space and you have a disciplinary infraction or have been arrested from school or have had some other discipline incident at a school, you've got other schools to choose from. In our rural context, that all gets very much diminished. You don't have 22 elementary schools to choose from. You might have one, right? We have a lot of rural districts that are all the same school. The whole school is on one physical plant, meaning elementary through 12th grade is literally in one location. So you don't have all these other choices around what to do. And that set up a really contextual difference that I started to be like, you really got to look at this differently, because just the ability to say, no, this isn't working. Let me take my child out of this school and put them over here and try this. You don't have that type of opportunity in many of our rural places. And then to compound that, especially in the Black Belt, you had a lot of school consolidation. So now do you not only have a lack of choice where you live, you may not even have a school in the town that you live in. And instead, your students are bused to somewhere else that's consolidated within the county. And so we see a lot of that in rural consolidation, which is a fiscal decision. It is not a community decision. People decide to close schools due to money. Rarely, I have yet to run into a case where it was in the best interest of the students. So I'll leave it at that. But those are some examples of the distinction. The other part is that many of our rural places do not have juvenile detention facilities. And so your urban context for the school to prison pipeline work, we'll send them to juvie for X amount of time, or our behavioral health center. And so then I get to a real context and they're like, we don't have a juvenile detention center in the county. Well, then what are you doing with these students? And so it just started to bring up other questions for me. that pivots me into this home education space because what can happen is, and they'll put students on what's called homebound. And homebound is where the school has said, we'll provide you with the curriculum and the materials, but your kid can't come back to the school until X date, or not at all, depending on how they have categorized the disciplinary incident. And so that really just took me down a very different line of thinking about how we understand the school to prison pipeline and disciplinary incidences across our context, like the distinction between urban and rural. And that fascinated me. And then it also moved me into thinking about school choice differently as well. So I had started, I say minor in school choice work probably back in 2011, 2010, somewhere in there. My first teaching job was in a charter school. And so I'm kind of like, oh, I get the school choice thing. But it was the only charter school in a rural school district that did have one high school, one junior high, and initially 3 elementaries, and then a charter school popped up. So so the families there, it felt like, oh, we got this other choice, right? But the functionality of it was that charter school didn't actually behave differently than its counterparts. And in our urban context, a lot of the rhetoric and discourse that we hear is that this charter is going to do these things that are so significantly different than our public school context. And that's why having charters is so valuable. And I'm not diminishing the value of charter schools. I'm just saying the distinction between their operation becomes challenging because back to discipline, you've got a student that's been suspended from this place. In our urban context, they often will move to a different school. But in our rural context, we don't have that type of choice that's happening in terms of their ability to just go to another school. And then when we add consolidation into that across the American Southern Black Belt, especially, but across the South as a whole, I think the disciplinary work in terms of students being homebound sort of leads me into a connection between the school to prison pipeline and homeschooling, because in essence, that's what you're asking parents to do against their desire to do so, to be direct about it. And so that functions really differently than our home educators who really want to home educate, who see themselves as the agents of their children's education and their children's first teachers. And it's a very different mindset that goes into the intentionality behind educating versus individuals who are swept into it because it's imposed upon them from the school district. So I would say those are some of the connections that I can make between the work
Right.
that I've done. We also see in many Black families who home educate is that they've had disciplinary issues and or race-based incidences within schools that cause them to say, you know what, y'all ain't got to worry about us. We're going to go ahead and head to the house and take care of this because these types of experiences within the schooling context are detrimental to my child, and I can't let y'all do that to them. And those are families that are intervening before we get into the school to prison pipeline piece. And so I see quite a bit of that as well, is where people step in and say, before you start trying to make my child what they call a repeat offender, I'm going to step in, pull them out of school, and home educate them. And so our motivations across why students are being home educated very much differ by the racialized bodies that are enacting home education. And so I think that's valuable to enter into this conversation as well.
Yeah, and that just brings us back to you were talking about the intentionality is different in rural spaces and the integration with that with racial context within the rural space. I understand even more what you were talking about the intentionality. And then obviously like how policymakers or even local, I'm thinking about even local school administrators and that decision, like what you said, like what if that student is that star athlete that that principal really wants on that high school team, that one high school team in the entire
Yep.
district, you know? So what do you do with that, and how do you set that policy at that school level? What projects you're working on right now? Because it sounds like you have a lot to choose from.
I mean, to be direct, I'm doing the most all the time. It feels like and I draw energy from it. I love research, period. And I really like the research that I do. I want to engage deeply with it and people who are thinking about it. There's different types of researchers. There are those who want to really talk to the people and get down into conversations with folks, especially qualitative researchers who are like, want to hear the stories of families and I want to really understand what they're doing and what they're going through and all of that. I think that is valuable work, and I absolutely support that. I second author that type of work oftentimes. But for me, my primary interest is often conceptualizing how we understand what's happening. Back to the discourse and rhetoric examinations. and data analysis around that. So one of my major projects right now really starts to unpack this question around what we know and understand around rural school choice and home education as an outcome related to lack of choice. It's a legal analysis that looks at privacy and extends Cheryl Field Smith conceptualization around educational justice. We think about justice as a legal issue, not just as an education issue. And so it intersects the two of those. And then Black home education as a viable outcome for that. So I'll bring you around to it. So what we do is an analysis at a county level. For this particular piece, we use 3 states just for management and clarity. So we look at 3 states and their ESAs, the educational savings accounts, and what you can do with them and what you can't do with them, and question whether or not this really gives us access to educational justice. And so what comes out of it is essentially no. And here's why. Many of our rural counties, and this examination looks specifically at rural counties within these 3 states, we see that there's not actually enough schools to have choice, which means that the rhetoric and discourse around choice is that, hey, these ESAs you can activate and then you can use them for all of these things. But in our rural context, we don't actually have those resources available to us. So, yes, technically, I have this thing that I can use, but in practice, I can't actually access what you're saying I'm supposed to have access to. So, for example, you can use the ESA funds to pay for private school tuition and fees in certain states. But there's no private school for you to go to in the county that you live in. So now do I really have choice? And so then we essentially say that home education then becomes the default. But rhetoric, legislation, politicians don't talk about home education as a function of school choice in the ways in which we hear about charters, privates, magnets. The political milieu and rhetoric doesn't include home education. So back to my point about, for me as a researcher, I want to think about what does this actually look like in practice in terms of conceptualizing what do we understand and what do we know. So we understand that they're saying ESAs can be used. Yes, access them. This is to make education more accessible and opportunity and all of that. But if we get down to educational justice, there may be a lack because these are folk choice. So that's
Yeah,
what I'm working on right now.
I cannot wait to see it in publication. Once it comes out, you have to let me
Yeah.
know.
Sure. I'm excited about it too because in thinking about our rural context, I really want us to have more conversations to bring to people's awareness of some of the distinction that you and I have just talked about and I've shared here. And I find that it often isn't. So when I get into conversations with especially legislators, they're like, I never thought about that, which I find fascinating because even legislators who represent rural districts and spaces, it is still not something that they are necessarily considering or even have thought of. And you have the rare individual who's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense because I know a family who homeschools. But overwhelmingly, many of our representatives, this is not something that's on their radar to really consider. It's about what kind of choices does your area that you represent really have in terms of that. And so a part of our analysis looks at surrounding counties too to say, okay, well, if this one county doesn't have any schools, what about everybody else that's around them? So without taking into account distance, because we know that's an issue too, and transportation. But if we just set that aside for a moment, which is big to set aside, but if we just set that aside for a moment, could you actually access this choice in these other counties that are surrounding? And what we found across this analysis is no, those counties don't have enough of those other types of resources to service who lives in that county and the surrounding counties that don't actually have that. And then one other nugget that I find fascinating also has to do with people who live on state lines. So you have a lot of rural counties that are right on state lines. You can't activate it and go across state lines to use it. Even if proximity wise, you're closer to this space that's across the state line and they have what you need, you can't take dollars across state lines. And so that presents this other barrier to access in terms of choice.
I can imagine how this intersects with the greater body of rural education literature. I'm here in North Carolina. We talk for 40 years about the Leandro case, which is all
Hmm.
about educational justice for rural spaces. I'm very excited to see this work come about and develop. Is there anything else that you haven't gotten a chance to talk about that you'd love to share?
Just want to sort of shout out some other scholars that have, I think, really valuable work within this Black home education space. So Matthew Rankin, he's out of Georgia. He does all of we would consider educational justice, and his really looks at environment as the main function of education. And I want to highlight that because I think there's this very like monolithic perception of what home educators do, and then more specifically Black home educators, because there's this perception that if you're Black and you home educate, you must be like militant or anti-establishment, and your goal in educating your child is antithetical to a democratic citizen. And what we find is that that is woefully untrue, and that we are responsibly preparing citizens for the democracy and for the republic. And so I think his work is fascinating because it just is another demonstration of Black home education that doesn't align with sort of this imaginary of what homeschooling looks like. And then Mariah Johnson's work with community structures around Black home education within the Atlanta, Georgia area, I think is really fascinating as well. And so I'm really thinking about how these communities of folks, learning pods, what tutoring services, and just folks who are identified by the state as homeschoolers, but their actual enactment of home education and what that looks like. And I think those things are valuable. And then the mother of Black home education, Cheryl Field Smith's work in her new book about creating educational justice that came out in 2025 on Black home education is just such a seminal piece for people to read that are interested in home education and homeschooling as a whole, period. And then more specifically around Black families, because she really takes us through 20 years of her work around Black home education. I think that's really valuable to how we understand it. And then Rochelle Somerville, her work that gets into disability in home education and her own experiences with having children who had some challenges and were identified for disabilities, and how she navigated that as a home educator and what that looked like for her. So there's a lot of people who are doing powerful and meaningful work, both at the practitioner level and at the researcher level as well. I'm excited to see where folks are going to start going in terms of microschooling in Black communal spaces. That's already happening. So if you're a rising researcher and wondering what can I look at, I'm going to give you a couple of items right now that might pique somebody's interest, right? Movements around microschooling and structures for microschooling and Black home education. And I'm putting those together, but how we see that function and then also construct what this looks like in terms of the church, because oftentimes Black communities are very localized around churches and the supports that they receive. And so I think that's a really valuable space to think about how do the enactment of homeschooling in a communal way, and the church is the space by which they do that. I think another one too is high concentrations of Black families that are in cloistered communities. And this one is challenging, but if you're in this community, I think it might be valuable and interesting. And those are Black Jews and those who are of the Nation of Islam. And I think those are spaces where we have these long back to histories and generational home education that's happening within Black context, but those are cloistered communities. So we don't know as much about what's happening there. And I don't think it's for an outsider to do. But again, I don't know who's listening. So I want to put that out there that if you're within any of those communities, that's something to consider, because I think we can learn a lot from those communities about their ways of enactment, but also resistance, and how they've navigated some of the challenges that those of us who are in places that are not cloistered haven't been able to do. So I think those are some things that, as a rising researcher in this space, might be fascinating or valuable to really think about. I think there's already those of us who are doing legal and policy analysis, and there's those of us who are really looking at what we know and understand of families. And so that work is going to keep going, but I think the places I just named are where we could find other avenues to examine.
Gosh, what an exciting call to action. I have a research agenda that's pretty packed full too, but now I'm like, ooh, that sounds interesting too. So if you heard Dr. Baker and you want to take up her call to action, please do. The religious minorities homeschooling specifically, and then the intersectionality of doubly minoritized, racially and religiously, is a very interesting space. Well, thank you for all your time today. I really appreciate
Yeah, absolutely.
that you shared with us.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for an episode of Homeschool Connections. For more resources, research, and data, connect with us on social media at JHU Homeschool, or visit us online at education.jhu.edu/edpolicy, where you can click through to explore the Homeschool Hub then scroll down to sign up for our newsletter. If today's episode sparked ideas or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, I'm Christy Batts with the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Research Lab.